Where are the Indigenous kids on Degrassi? Today is National Truth and Reconciliation Day here in Canada, and it's a question I'd like to ask. Where are the Indigenous kids? Degrassi started in 1979 and had multiple iterations up until 2017, and in absolutely zero of those iterations are there any Indigenous students. Now, there are actors, Indigenous actors, who play students at Degrassi. The actress who plays Grace is Indigenous. Her mom is also Indigenous on the show. The actor who played Cam, his mother is Indigenous. Miss Suave, the guidance counselor, is Indigenous. Miss Avery is Indigenous. But absolutely never does this come up in Degrassi, the topic of being Indigenous, especially being an Indigenous student at the school. And I think this is really missing from the show's history. One of the reasons that I love Degrassi so much is because it put my story on TV. If you know me, you know that I love Fiona Coyne. I related to her so much that I literally felt like I was going to high school and living my life and then coming back home and watching it play out on screen. And that meant so much to me to see myself. So one of the things that gets me really upset is whenever there are other kids in Canada who didn't get to see themselves on Degrassi. Why didn't Indigenous kids get to see their storylines play out on TV? One of the things I also hear is that we've only really started to talk about Indigenous issues recently. I know that when I grew up, I knew nothing about what it meant to be Indigenous in Canada. This is not something that we learned. Actually, when I was in school, I kind of learned that Indigenous people were people of the past, that like they didn't even really exist anymore. And then that left room for me to learn a lot of stereotypes when I was growing up. But Degrassi stood up for kids all the time and took these kind of invisible kids and put them on TV. Like Adam Torres, for example, was one of the first trans characters on TV. So why didn't Degrassi do that for Indigenous kids? I mean, you had Indigenous kids showing up to work for you. You had Indigenous actors showing up. How come they never got their storylines on TV? And I think one of the main things that kind of makes me upset about the fact that we never got an Indigenous kid on Degrassi is that back in 1992, Degrassi did a series called Degrassi Talks. This is where they took the cameras and the microphones and they put them in the hands of the actual Degrassi cast. They were going out across Canada and they were interviewing teenagers about the issues that are on Degrassi and said, hey, how do these issues affect you? And if you watch that documentary, over 1/3 of the people that they interview are Indigenous. So they have all of this data and all of this amazing storytelling about what it's like to be Indigenous in Canada and be affected by all these issues on Degrassi. And they continue to go on to make Degrassi for 18 more seasons after that. And not one single time does an Indigenous kid get put on the show. And of course, I don't want to take away from the fact that we do have Indigenous actors. That is huge representation. But Degrassi is always the show that put these stories on TV to try to make kids feel seen. And I'm just curious as to why such a huge group of kids in Canada got so easily looked over the course of 40 years. So National Truth and Reconciliation Day, those are the questions that I like to ask. I hope that if we ever get a reboot, we get an Indigenous kid as a lead character.